All right. Hello, everyone. So last time we were wrapping up World War II, and we ended with not only the surrender of Japan, and of course, Germany and Italy, but with the US sort of propelling the world into a new global order where the US would be the dominant power. We would, the month after the war, set up this new sort of international body, the United Nations. Its headquarters would be in New York, of course. And we're going to start looking at this new American-shaped world that we're going to enter during this particular time period. So let's get started. Share my screen. So this is sort of a dual image here of, on the left-hand side here, or actually let's start with the right. On the right-hand side here, we've got what's known as the big three. We've got Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, of course. Feel like that Sesame Street song, one of these things is not like the other, right? You've got the two liberal democratic leaders over here, and you've got the communist dictator on the right-hand side. What's interesting to note is that just a few months later, this picture is taken in February of 1945. Franklin Roosevelt would die within 2 months. He was wheelchair bound and he chain smoked cigarettes, which is not good for your blood pressure or your heart. And he would pass away in April of 45. You have to remember that America was a very young country in the 30s, meaning most people were under the age of 40. Most people could not even remember there being another president. 12 years he was president. This is before there was constitutional term limits. You could run as much as you wanted. There was a norm that you only ran twice, but there was nothing in the Constitution. So FDR ran 4 times, won 4 times, but died just a couple of months into his 4th term. He would be replaced by Harry Truman there in the middle. And surprising to everyone in the world, this picture is taken at Potsdam. Potsdam's in July of 45. It's 2 months after the German surrender. Winston Churchill would lose elections just in a week or 2 after that picture and be replaced by Clement Attlee. Churchill, fascinating figure. He was sort of the right man, right time. He was not prime minister when the war began. That was Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain had a vote of no confidence because he had appeased Adolf Hitler through, all through the 30s. Churchill was telling people, we got to stand up to this guy. So in June of 1940, Churchill wins, sort of, deposing Chamberlain. Churchill gets in there. He serves for the duration of the war. And almost immediately when the war ends, Churchill is kicked out of office, mainly because great war leader, but when the peace came, he had ideas that people in Britain were not very fond of. Number one, the British Labour Party movement wanted universal health care, something that we're talking about in America, we've been talking about for a long time. And there was this very radical idea that because of the togetherness of the war, because everybody had been pulling together to defeat evil and save the world, and because Britain had survived that conflict and fought for every day of the war. Nobody fought in World War II longer than the British did. I suppose you could say Japan, because they started the war in Asia a bit earlier. And they were just so relieved when it was over and felt, you know what, this generation deserves to be taken care of. We're going to have universal health care. We're going to nationalize all the hospitals in the country. Churchill thought that was a terrible idea. It would lead to communism in the country. And most of the British people just said, old man, we're going to put you into early retirement. The other idea that he had that didn't go over well is he wanted to hold on to Britain's empire. And the feeling had pretty much developed by 1945, led by the United States, I might add, that the world should decolonize, that we should set free all these colonies we have. The US made preparations even before World War II. I find this amazing that as early as 1934, the US government said, we can't stay in the Philippines forever. This is not a sustainable activity. We need to get out. And they made preparations that by 1946, the US would liberate the Philippines. Now, we would probably maintain bases there. We'd have a friendly democratic government, but we wouldn't tell them what to do. They'd have their own parliament and their own president, etc. Then the Japanese invaded and conquered the Philippines in 42. We fought valiantly to regain this colony, and immediately upon reconquering it, the US set it free, which we've talked about a lot of negative things the US has done in this class, but life is complicated and nuanced. This is one of those circumstances, again, where we behaved very well, right on schedule. As soon as we reconquered the Philippines, we sort of guided into independence, which is a wonderful thing to do. So Churchill is out, Clement Attlee is in, Roosevelt would die of a stroke in April of 45, just 10 or 12 days before Hitler killed himself. And Truman would take over as president there to end the war. And Truman actually does a pretty good job ending the war there. I mean, the war with Germany is all but over. It's just 3 weeks from being over. The war in Japan took several months longer, and he does a pretty good job there. So this is a map of Germany. At the end of World War II, just by happenstance, the way that it ended, the Soviets would swoop in from the east. The British, Americans, and the French would swoop in from the west. They would meet right in the middle of the country. And that accidental, just sort of, where the army lines were at the end of the war, that is going to dictate the boundaries of these two countries, East and West Germany, for the next 44 years. You guys are too young for this, but I remember when I was a kid, there was an East Germany and a West Germany, just like there's a North Korea and a South Korea. And just like probably you guys imagine, North Korea is not going anywhere. Kim Jong-un, he's probably going to be dictator for most of our lives. I didn't think when I was a kid that East and West Germany would merge together and get, reunified. That to us was crazy. It was like East Germany was the communists and West Germany was the good guys. But no. In 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down. In 1990, East and West Germany get back together. But for a long time, this division became semi-permanent. Now, it was never intended to be that way. World War II is kind of bizarre in that at the end of it, there's no major treaty. There's no treaty that ends World War II. World War I, something like 18 nations sign on the dotted line and say, Treaty of Versailles, we agree to these principles. And it all went to hell in the 20s and 30s. In World War II, no one could agree on much of anything. In the first year or so of peace, the US is getting along with the Soviets fairly well. There's some hiccups here and there, but we had to cooperate with them, and things actually go fairly smoothly. They agree to form the United Nations with us. They draft the charter or constitution for it. There's going to be 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The Russians agree with that. We are going to round up all the top Nazis and Japanese military brass and put them on trial for war crimes, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity. There was this new idea that sovereignty had to change, that since the Middle Ages, really, since, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, there was this idea of sovereignty, that a prince had complete control over his subjects and it was no business of anybody else. The reason for that is actually good, because so many other countries like Spain would say, hey, you want to be Protestant in your country, we're Catholic, we don't want you to be, we're going to invade and change your lives. The idea was it's no business of an outside country what religion we are. But what if a country's really doing horrible things like a genocide or like a very aggressive war? They have to be held accountable. They can't just hide behind, well, I was just following orders at the time and this was my own country. After the founding of the United Nations, the US felt we could put these top Nazis on trial. This is known as denazification, that they had to be purged out of government. And so top Nazi military leaders, political leaders, generals, business leaders that were really cozy, business leaders that were doing awful things like experimenting in concentration camps on prisoners of war or just citizens that were locked up. Hideous things. A standard is set that says you can't do this. If you are a dictator or aspiring dictator, beware, because what you do, you might be held accountable after your downfall. And so this was a new standard that the US set up, and the Soviets agreed with it. There had to be trade and agreement and communication between the two occupation zones. The Russians in the East had all the agricultural areas. The British, French, and Americans had all the industrial areas. There had to be trade and cooperation. That is done very well. The Russians, amazingly, they had conquered all of East Germany. And per our pre-war agreements in 1942 and 43, it was agreed that whoever was going to conquer Berlin, that was the ultimate prize. 6 million German citizens, whoever conquered it, the other side would get to occupy the other half. And the Russians were good to that agreement, even though they had conquered the whole eastern part of Germany, fought very hard and bled and died and sacrificed to earn it. They opened the roads and allowed British, French, and American soldiers in that first year of peace to come in and occupy the western half of Berlin. So that's what you're looking at there. It's a very weird political phenomenon, but the western half of Berlin is politically tied to the western half of Germany, even though it's geographically separated. That would become a very weird and bizarre phenomenon going forward. But again, nobody thought this would be permanent. Everybody thought, well, we'll hammer things out with the Russians in 6 months. It wasn't going to come to that. It started to break down, the sort of international agreement, because we and the Russians had very different goals for the peace. The US, relatively unscathed from the war, we did lose 292,000 soldiers, no civilians, no buildings were destroyed, and our economy was on top of the world. 1 out of every 2 things on the planet is made in the United States at the end of World War II. Nothing had happened like that before or since, that the US constituted half of global GDP. Why is that? Well, Japan was destroyed. Germany was destroyed. Britain was bankrupt. The Soviets were half destroyed. We were the only ones making anything of value after World War II, and we were ready to sell it to the world. The US does a complete 180. Ever since 1790, we had had a tariff of some kind. Democrats always would lower it. Republicans would always raise it, but we always had one. Well, after World War II, kind of the idea was, why do we need a tariff anymore? Like, what are we protecting ourselves from? Nobody else even makes cars anymore, right? We don't need to worry about Mitsubishi or Mercedes after World War II. So why have it? And the idea was, we really just want markets, so we want to encourage everyone to trade. And we also remembered that prior to World War II, Smoot-Hawley tariff had shut down global trade. That's bad. The more that countries are interconnected, the less likely they are to go to war, right? Like right now, the US and China don't get along, but we're sort of forced to be peaceful because it'd be unthinkable if either one didn't have the other, right? Like, who would make all our Barbie dolls in factories in China and sell them at cheap prices in Walmart? And who would provide all that employment for people in China, if not for American corporations? They buy a lot of our goods, we buy a lot of their goods, they loan us a lot of money. It's just a nice little arrangement, right? And so that's the idea, that we needed to build a post-war peace where there was a lot of trade, investment, and connectivity. So part of the United Nations is the World Bank. We set up this idea that if countries are in trouble, a financial trouble like Germany in the 20s, they could get a bailout from the World Bank. The rest of the world would loan them money through this entity. They would pay it back over time, and they could avoid huge catastrophes. Great idea. And the Soviets agree with us on that. However, they have much more urgent concerns. They have been attacked twice by Germany through Poland in the 20th century, losing millions of lives in each of those wars. So the Soviets, rather than wanting markets for their exports and rather than wanting, peace, they need survival. They need a buffer zone in Eastern Europe because they felt if the Germans were ever to rearm and invade again, the Soviets would stop them right in Poland. We're not going to wait and fight our own territory anymore. So there's very different concerns. The Soviets are never really going to disarm from World War II. They had a military of 15 million soldiers at the end of the war, and they never really send the soldiers home. That made us very nervous. Those soldiers would remain in Poland, violating previous agreements. We had thought that Stalin would be good to his word and get out of Poland and help them, groom themselves into a nice democracy. He did not do that. He kept the Red Army there indefinitely. We screamed, shouted, hollered, and he just said, well, too bad. What are you going to do? You're going to kick me out? The US was ready to demobilize. It had been American tradition that we don't have large standing armies. It's very expensive and we don't want to do it. And moreover, this time around, it was felt we don't really need to. We have this huge super weapon, the atomic bomb. That'll keep the Soviets in check. A lot of people said, what's going to keep 15 million Russians from just pouring into West Germany, Holland, Belgium, and France? Well, the fact that we might drop a bomb on Moscow would discourage them from that. Stalin was relieved that the war was over. He wasn't going to have an out-and-out invasion, and the bomb did indeed frighten him, and they are going to start their own program to rapidly steal that technology and build their own bomb to kind of counterbalance our technology. But the US military goes from 16.5 million soldiers down to 600,000 very rapidly. Just in about 4 years, it gets down that low, with the biggest drops coming in that first year of peace. We still would have 1 million soldiers in Germany and 1 million in Japan to rebuild those countries after the war, and we did a very fine job of doing that. But people wanted to go home. People wanted to go home. Dozens of ships were arriving home every day with huge parades. The parades and festivals went all through the fall and winter of 1945, and people were ready for peace, absolutely so. Roosevelt had said before the war ended that, like the British felt, this war should mean something, and moving into the peace, there should be a government that cares for this generation because we saved the world, essentially. He had ideas that there would be universal health care and, all kinds of government-supported phenomenon. Not very much is going to be made of this. FDR dies, and Truman doesn't necessarily agree with all these plans. So what we are going to get, which is rather extraordinary, is the GI Bill of Rights. Roosevelt knew that he could kind of sneak in a little bit of these socialist and liberal programs in the guise that it was helping the veterans. Previous to this, the Civil War, World War I, there was a bonus or a pension arranged for veterans. This time around, there would be a GI Bill of Rights, meaning if you served in the Army, you would get money for college, you would get low interest loans to go to any college of your choice, and that would lay the foundation and build skills for a whole generation of Americans. And this was an extraordinary idea. It paid huge dividends, and it would lead us into the greatest wave of prosperity the US ever faced. Between 1937, when the last recession hit, right? We were in the Roosevelt recession, we had to climb our way out of it. We were on an upward trajectory. Production, employment, everything boomed from 1937 all the way until 1973 without a blip. There were little micro recessions in 1958, and there were others here and there, but the recessions lasted 6 months and they were over with. And so the US was looking forward to peace and prosperity. However, there was this problem of the Soviet Union, of course. There were warnings in 46, but if you look at public opinion polls, most Americans felt the Russians could be trusted. We worked with them in the war, we could work with them in the peace. And that first year of peace in 46, most people said, it's fine. There were warnings. People like George Kennan, who was the US ambassador to the Soviet Union, was asked by President Truman, why is Stalin being so difficult? And Kennan wrote an extremely long telegram, hundreds of pages long, and sent this back to Truman saying, I think that people have forgotten a lot of the history of the Russian Revolution and this difficult relationship. And he laid out the plan for the peace. He called it containment, that the Soviets are wounded by World War II. They do want to kind of push on the cause of communist revolution over the world, but what they're going to do is just kind of give money and support to guerrilla or rebel groups throughout the world. They're not going to invade anybody. And we really need to just counter them. If they do try to expand to another area, if they spend $1, we spend $2, and we stop that spreading of communism. But we're not going to kick them out of Eastern Europe. That would be crazy. That would precipitate World War III, and nobody wanted to fight another world war. FDR gets a lot of flack today from conservatives that he allowed the Russians to take over Poland. That's the way the war ended. He could have complained about it more, I suppose, but there was nothing he could have done about it. No American, not the Republicans, not any conservative, not anybody, wanted to invade Poland in 1946 and evict the Russians. That would have been crazy. There would have been no support for that. Churchill, likewise, the next month gave a very famous speech, his Iron Curtain speech, where he essentially said, all right, we just ended World War II, but there's this new enemy out there, the communists, and they've divided Europe down the middle from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. In the Eastern zone is the Soviet sphere, and we need to stand up to them. So what's going on at home for the peace? Well, first, People forget how rough that first year was. It was very rough. In fact, Truman prosecutes an end to the war. His first 5 months or so were very successful. People were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. And he did a very fine job ending the war. But once the war ended in September of 45, people started to complain because the economy was just not kicking in fast enough. It took 6 months basically to demobilize, which is pretty fast. You think it took 18 months to mobilize, it would take as long to demobilize. There were no cars yet. You had to get on a waiting list. And GIs were coming home from the war. They and their wives had these fat bank accounts. They'd worked for 4 years and socked away a lot of money. They'd go to the car dealership. Guess what? You can't get a new Ford or Chevy yet. You're going to have to wait 6 months, 9 months, or a year, get your name on a waiting list. For every new car that came out in 46, there were probably 10, 15, 20 purchasers. And so the rationing would continue. You couldn't run out and just buy whatever you wanted at the grocery store, leather, silk, all that stuff. It took time to kind of switch over to civilian production. Now, I don't want to oversell this. It was much better than in every other country in the world, but it did take time, and everybody blamed Harry Truman. Workers complained because their wages were being cut back. Again, like after World War I, the economy slowed down. People were thrown out of their defense plant jobs, or their hours were cut back, so they went on strike. 46 would be a peak year for strikes. It used to be 1919, 3,600 strikes. We beat that by 1,000. There were 4,600 strikes in 1946. Because of that, there was inflation. Because of the huge amount of deficit spending in World War II, prices skyrocketed. And to combat that, Harry Truman said, we're going to freeze wages and we're going to freeze prices, which caused shortages, right? You can artificially say, hey, you cannot raise your prices, but if businesses can't raise their prices, they have to ration another way, and that is, we'll just run out of things, right? It's kind of like when you go to Cuba and you show up in the grocery store, half the time there's no meat, there's no bread, right? Because they keep prices very low so everyone can buy it, but everything sells out in like 10 seconds. So everyone blamed Truman for this. The inflation, the strikes, and of course there was an incredible strike, one that was very disruptive in the summer of 46. The worst one of all was the railroad strike. Every railroad in the country went on strike in the summer of 46, right when everybody was coming home and trying to get home, right? Soldiers are coming into New York or into Long Beach, and they're trying to get on trains to get home, and there's no trains. You're having to like rent a car, rent a taxi, or just rent a hotel for a couple of weeks until the strike's over. Truman was livid because he was getting all the blame. The workers would not go back to work. They wanted a wage increase. He was very angry. And this was not very much appreciated by the American people. So Truman did one of the more foolish things any president has ever done. He went to Congress and he proposed a bill allowing him the emergency authority to draft railroad workers into the army and then order them back to work. I mean, I guess you could do that, but that's kind of what like dictatorships do, right? When workers aren't doing what you want, there's a labor dispute, you just order them in the army and say, well, now you're working for me. The law doesn't go through, but it's amazing that he proposed this. And the labor unions turned on Harry Truman. They said, this guy does not know who his master is. The labor unions are the heart and soul of the Democratic Party, and we're going to come after him. That fall was a midterm election, November of 46. And the AFL and the CIO both told their 10 million followers, boycott the elections, don't vote. Let's show Harry Truman who his master is. So Harry Truman got a very conservative Republican Congress in the fall of 46. And they came in there and they had no notion that they were going to work with Harry Truman on anything. One of the first things they passed is the Taft-Hartley Act. So this is one of those weird things that boomeranged on the unions. They did this to get back at Harry Truman, but the Republican Congress went after the unions. Taft-Hartley is passed in 47. You don't need to know really all the ins and outs of it, but it would weaken, it would water down the power of unions. It would make it harder for them to organize. It would be harder for them to organize secondary boycotts. A primary boycott is when you, the union, organize and you say, we don't like Walmart. Let's refuse to buy from Walmart, and all our workers will organize that. A secondary boycott is when you then boycott any business that does business with Walmart, right? All the toy manufacturers, the clothing manufacturers, you know, all that stuff. Now, it's amazing to me that you can outlaw a boycott, which is freedom of speech and freedom of association, but it was ruled by antitrust laws to be an infringement on free trade. And so Congress could regulate it, and Congress came in and said, nope, no secondary boycotts, illegal. You couldn't strike or you couldn't seize a factory until there was an 80-day cooling off period. There would be no more closed shops. A closed shop is where you're forced to join a union. You couldn't use union dues for political campaign. Wildcat strikes were ruled illegal. A wildcat strikes when the member leadership of the union says, let's negotiate, but the membership just says, well, we're going to go on strike anyway. And they go out, they do a walkout against the authorization of their union leadership. And of course, because we're now afraid of communists, Taft-Hartley would purge communists out of the labor movement. There were, believe it or not, quite a few communists in the CIO, not in the AFL. And those people would all be kicked out. You would have to swear a loyalty oath to the United States government, and you had to swear that you were never a communist. And if you were, you would be thrown out of government, essentially. So Truman then, well, let's tell a little story about Harry Truman before we go on to the next slide, because 46 was just miserable to Harry Truman. Truman is the last president we ever had that had no college education whatsoever. I mean, imagine that act to follow. You have FDR, who was this incredible figure, beloved in his time, and he's gone. And most people didn't even know who the vice president was. FDR had 3 vice presidents. He had John Nance Garner for the first 8 years until 1940. Then he had Henry Wallace replace him. And then Henry Wallace was kicked off the ticket in 1944. Henry Wallace, a very interesting figure. He's today what we would call a democratic socialist, kind of like a Bernie Sanders figure. He had been Secretary of Agriculture. And he had ideas that we kind of can get behind today. He said there should be no segregation in America, and we need strong desegregation laws. Talk about being ahead of your time. He was 10 years ahead of his time, and most people in the Democratic Party thought he was kind of cuckoo for that. He also had the idea that we should have socialized medicine, kind of like the British system. That's what many liberals in the Democratic Party want today. He was kicked off the ticket because of these very liberal stances, and Harry Truman was kind of a moderating force. Conservatives in the Democratic Party wanted Strom Thurmond, South Carolina, what they called Dixiecrat, Southern Democrat, because Southerners kind of felt, you know what, we founded this party on states' rights and, you know, Thomas Jeffersonian values. And so they wanted Strom Thurmond, kind of an old segregationist, states' rights kind of person. Northerners didn't like that. And so they said, you know, what about Henry Wallace? Southerners didn't like that. So they said, what about Harry Truman? Nobody knows who that guy is. Yeah, that was a bit of an exaggeration. Truman was born in Missouri. He served in World War I as an artillery captain, had a great war record, had no formal education, just high school. And he was just known as being a very honest broker and dealer. He owned a haberdashery, that's a hat shop. He went out of business in 1922, he and his business partner. And he knew everyone in town, though, and everybody in town adored him because he was honest, straight shooter. He served in local government, you know, school boards and city council and mayor and things like that. And he finally got picked up to run for Congress by the big city machine there, by the Kansas City machine. He then served in Congress all during the 30s as kind of a New Deal Democrat. And during World War II, by that time, he had climbed to be senator from Missouri. And he got his name as a straight shooter who went after war profiteers. War profiteers are people who say, oh my God, there's so much money to be made. I'm going to make money selling shoes to the army. But you make them real cheap and shoddy, and, you know, the heel breaks through on the first mile of a 30-mile march, and 16.5 million soldiers have no shoes to go fight the Nazis and the Japanese. So Truman would haul them up in front of the cameras. Again, no TV yet, but it would be filmed and shown in movie theaters, and just humiliate these war profiteers and pretty much guilt them into giving all this money back that they had essentially stole. So Truman made a bit of a name for himself, but still, you know, honest, fair broker, but most people outside of Missouri hadn't really heard of him. In fact, when FDR died, the newspapers said, Harry Truman, the new president. And most Americans said, Harry who? I've never heard of this guy. Then they read his biography in the paper and they got very worried. Only a high school diploma, no college. One of the funnier things about Harry Truman is that his name is Harry S. Truman. The S does not have a period after it. If you see it written that way in books, that is an error. His middle name was the letter S. Bizarre and frightening, actually. It's like, this guy's going to lead us and his middle name is S. What were his parents, hippies or something? No, they weren't hippies, but they couldn't agree on a name. Mom wanted Steve, dad wanted Sam. They couldn't agree, so they just left it S on the birth certificate. They never filled it in, and his middle name was the letter S. Kind of crazy. There was a saying in the 40s and 50s, and my father is old enough that he remembers this. He's born in 1943, and he remembers when Harry Truman left office in 1953. And most people have the idea good riddance. And the saying was, LSMFT, Lord save me from Truman. Now, that doesn't get much of a laugh now, but you got to realize that one of the biggest corporations in America was R.J. Reynolds, Philip Morris, Brown and Williamson, these big tobacco plantation companies. They owned most of Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And Americans smoked at the time. Most people smoked. I mean, it is extraordinary when you think about it. You could smoke in movie theaters before about the 70s and 80s. You could, I remember when you could smoke in restaurants in California up till about 1995 is when they finally banned it. There was a smoking and a non-smoking. You could smoke on airplanes. You could smoke anywhere. My uncle was a butcher his entire career. He's like, we used to cut meat in the 60s, smoking cigarettes while we were cutting meat. Doctors would smoke in the doctor's office while they were giving you a medical examination. You know, my mother tells me when she first got a job at the VA, she would have to light, that was part of her job, was not only changing bedpans for the veterans, but lighting their cigarettes and making sure their oxygen machine was turned off so that the room didn't blow up. When they finally did tell the veterans, you can't smoke anymore in the hospital because there were too many accidents, they got really upset. I mean, it's amazing today that this was even an issue. It's like, just don't smoke. What's the problem, right? Everyone smoked in the country. So because of that, Lucky Strike was the American brand, almost like Coca-Cola or Levi Jeans or McDonald's. It was just everywhere. So much so that in Germany, the first year of peace, there was no currency in Germany. You tried to use US dollars if you could find them. If you couldn't find them, Lucky Strike cigarettes is what people traded. Quite literally, like hungry Germans would get Lucky Strike cigarettes from the soldiers. Soldiers would like trade cigarettes to people for what they wanted. Or chocolate bars or nylons, you know, whatever. Soldiers would get a lot of weekly allotments in their kits, and then they would try to wine and dine the German women or try to get something from the German business owners there. And they would often give them a pack of smokes, and then they would get some sort of good or service for that. So Lucky Strike advertising was everywhere, and their advertising campaign was LSMFT. Lucky Strike means fine tobacco. Those posters were everywhere. My father's like, you heard it on the radio. It was in movie theaters. It was like everywhere. And so the joke was LSMFT. You're right about that. Lord save me from Truman. Nobody thought he had the stuff. Everybody thought this is a guy that's in way over his head. If only FDR had lived, everything would be perfect. So we go into 47 with divided government. We have a president that's Democratic. We have a Congress that's Republican. And they don't agree with any of his liberal kind of socialistic programs. However, Truman will have a huge revival in 47, mostly over foreign policy. It started to dawn on Harry Truman that the Soviets were a huge threat and that we had to counteract that threat. So in March, there is trouble in Greece and Turkey. Now, here is the trouble. Greece, after World War II, it had been invaded and occupied by the Nazis. The British land there in 45 and take the surrender of the Nazis and escort them home. And this happened in many, many countries all over the globe. We had to decide what comes next. There's a power vacuum, and the army that's in charge can kind of install whomever they want. Would the old Greek monarchy come back, the king and the queen from prior to World War II? Or would there be some other faction that would take control? Well, the British installed the monarchy back on the throne, and there were a lot of rebels in the hills in northern Greece, communist rebels that wanted to overthrow the monarchy. So you got to understand the appeal that communism had in the mid-40s. Not so much in the US, but in the rest of the world. To many Europeans, everyone cozied up to the Nazis. The Catholic Church did. Most of the Protestant churches did too. most of the democracies did until it was almost too late, until September of 39. Most people just cozied up to them. The one group that fought the fascists from the first day onward was the communists, whether it was the communists in Germany itself, or in Spain, or in Italy, or the Soviet Union, or rebel bands, you know, within occupied areas. It was the communists who did most of the fighting. And so most people respected it, at least as a system that defeated fascism, that defeated the Nazis. And so within Greece, the monarchy had totally disgraced itself because they surrendered and they collaborated with the Nazis, and the guerrilla fighters in the hills had fought the Nazis every day of the war. And so there's a sort of civil war that's broken out there, and the US is very concerned. Now, the British decide they're leaving in 1947. Their empire is crumbling at this point. In fact, you could pretty much chart 1947 as the year that the Pax Britannica, the British Empire, is no more. They were bankrupt. They had a debt that was about 250% of their GDP. Ours was about 125%, only about half of that. And they were exhausted. They were leaving everywhere. They left India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh that year. They would leave Palestine that year as well. And they decided they were going to leave Greece and Turkey. Now, who cares about Greece and Turkey? Well, the biggest issue is that Greece and Turkey are right here on the Dardanelles. The Soviet Union does not have any warm water ports except for the Black Sea. They have, you know, huge areas up in the Arctic, but it's choked with ice for about 5-6 months of the year. They've got the Baltic, but that can be bottled up easily between, you know, Denmark and Sweden through the Kiel Canal here, through the North Sea. They've got some ports in the Far East. Their only real access to the Atlantic is the Black Sea going out through the Dardanelles and then out through Gibraltar or Suez. If you can control Turkey and Greece in a friendly way and have, you know, military outposts here on the Dardanelles, you can bottle up the Soviet fleet within the Black Sea and not give them access to the Mediterranean in the event of a big war. Not only that, but the British had all these military bases in Greece. We were propping up a friendly government. If the communists in Greece march into Athens, we would lose all those military bases. We would lose Greece as an ally. We would lose them as a trading partner. It would be a huge blow to our prestige. And so Truman was told this by the British, and he said, okay. He goes to the Congress, a Republican Congress, and says, we are going to need $400 million to give to the communists in Greece. Now, Turkey did not have any kind of real communist threat, but they were having financial problems, and there was fear that, you know, there might be a communist takeover. So he went to the Republicans and asked them for that. Now, the Republicans typically do not like foreign aid. Sounds like a welfare program to them. And they were very opposed to the idea. But Truman did a very good job of scaring the hell out of everyone by basically painting this horrible picture that if we don't stand up to the Soviets, they will be encouraged by this. This is where the Munich Analogy comes in. What's the Munich Analogy? In 1938, that was the moment in September when Hitler said, I want the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. They did not stand up to him, Britain and France and the Soviet Union. Had they stood up to him then, you probably avoid World War II. A lot of people don't know this. We know now that there was a plot by Hitler's own generals to assassinate him in September of 38 because they were terrified of going to war at that point. And they thought, no one's going to stand for this. We're bullying Czechoslovakia. The British and French will declare war and we will lose everything. We got to kill this guy. And because Britain and France just served up Czechoslovakia on a plate to Hitler, the generals backed off, and the rest is history, I should say. So the lesson now is you don't let a bully people. You got to stand up to him in the beginning because appeasement makes the aggressor more aggressive. And so the picture painted was that if we don't stand up to Stalin now, he'll be fomenting aggression everywhere. And before you know it, there'll be communist rebels in San Francisco taking over the Golden Gate Bridge, right? So the Congress opens its wallet, the money flows, we give arms and weapons to the Greek monarchy, and they brutally crush and repress the communists there. And we keep our bases and we keep our allies. It was a very successful plan. On the heels of this comes the Marshall Plan, one of the most incredible things the US has ever done. So here's the story on this. So in 1946, George C. Marshall, our the head of the armed forces during World War II, and then later became Secretary of State, traveled to Europe in late 46, and he was appalled by what he saw. What he saw was formerly the richest continent in the world struggling to feed themselves. This was the coldest winter on record in over 100 years. The roads were clogged with snow and ice. The railway systems and roads have been blown up by British and American bombing and hadn't been rebuilt. And so people were on the verge of freezing to death because they couldn't get heating oil or coal into their homes, and they couldn't get food either. And so Marshall said, this is really frightening, not only from a humanitarian standpoint, but from a geopolitical standpoint, meaning it's bad that people are suffering. And when they're suffering, they're going to go join communist organizations. It was very frightening that in Italy, the second strongest party there, marching in the streets with full hammer and sickles, was the Communist Party. In Belgium, in Holland, second largest party, the Communist Party. In France, the second largest party was the Communist Party. In West Germany, even though they don't have a constitution yet, and they're not voting yet, and there's still a huge American military presence there that would not allow a communist takeover, people are marching in the streets demanding solutions, and they're talking about it. This was terrifying to Americans because you don't even need a rebel takeover. You don't need the Soviets to roll the tanks in. All you need is that through elections, these European peoples will elect communist leaders. We will lose our military bases. We'll lose our trading partners. We'll lose our alliances. And Stalin will be, stroking his beard in that underground cave where he plans world domination, right? Kind of like some James Bond villain, like Dr. Evil or something like that. And so Marshall told this to Truman, and Truman goes back to a Republican Congress and asks for $13 billion. At first, he asked for $400 million for Turkey and Greece. Now he's asking for $13 billion, billion with a B. This was a huge endeavor. Mind you, this is not a loan like, hey, we're going to give you money, pay us back. This was a grant. This was free money that we had no expectations that this would ever be repaid. And likewise, the Lend-Lease stuff, guess what? FDR lied. He had said in 41, don't worry, we're going to get all this money back. And he was whispering to both Stalin and Churchill, don't worry, we're not going to ask for this money back. And then Truman had to go and tell the American people, and by the way, we're not getting the Lend-Lease money back either. Not much of it anyway. Like some of it would be paid back, but most of it would be forgiven. Now, I want you to note the nearly comic rendering of this program. No victorious country in history that I'm aware of has ever paid its former enemies or allies. Usually when you win a war, you economically strangulate your enemies. You make them pay tribute to you, right? This is what the Mongols did. This is what the British and French did after World War I, made Germany pay reparations. The US is saying, we defeated you, now here's some money. First of all, we paid our allies, which was nice of us, right? These orange bars, if you're wondering, what does that mean? The orange bars represent the relative aid that each of these countries received under the Marshall Plan. Britain would get the lion's share because they were our number one ally. They held out. Remember, there was a critical year there, June of 40 to June of 41, where Britain stood alone. America was not helping at all until March of 41. We gave Lend-Lease aid. And not until June of 41 did the Soviet Union get invaded and join them. They held out. They were the moral guidance there in the war. So we're going to pay you guys. Great job. And we know that you're really struggling with the peace because you're bankrupt. Here's some money, rebuild everything. They've been bombed out too, like everybody else. And we paid France, Holland, Denmark, Belgium, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden money, right? Okay, well, let's hold on Sweden, but Norway. These were countries that barely fought a day in World War II, all due respect, but France fought for 4 weeks and then they had their hand out saying, hey, we were your allies too. Yeah, for about a minute. So, okay, you have some. What this reminds me of is like, dad gets his wallet out because, teenager comes downstairs and says, Dad, can I have some money? I'm going on a date. Sure, son, daughter, whatever, here you go, $100, go out and have fun. And then like everyone else in the house has this incredible hearing. Do I hear a wallet opening? And all the other kids get in line and say, since you got your wallet open, I want some money too. Oh, and but you guys haven't done anything. Yeah, but we want some money too. We gave money not only to our allies that fought well, our allies that fought poorly. We gave money to neutral countries. Switzerland had the gall to ask for money. So did Sweden. So did Portugal. So did Iceland. So did Ireland. So did Turkey. None of these countries fought at all in World War II. They were out for themselves and they managed to stay completely out of it. Yet still they had the gall to say, hey, America, you're giving money. Why don't you give us money too? And we did. We were that gracious that we gave them money as well. Then we turned around and gave money to our enemies. We gave money to Italy. We gave money to West Germany. We gave money to Japan. Japan's not under the Marshall Plan. It's under a totally different system. But we pumped billions of dollars into Japan to rebuild everything. Didn't have to. We could have just let them languish there. We could have done anything we wanted. We could have enslaved every last Japanese citizen and made them work for us for the rest of history, which I'm very glad we did not. But that thought was not in anyone's mind, not even really right-wing generals like Douglas MacArthur. He knew that Japan was a natural ally. It could be rebuilt into an ally, and that the times had changed and that alliances switched. Now China was going to be the enemy because they had a huge communist uprising there that they would eventually win in 1949. And we needed allies like Japan, and we had to rebuild them strong again. Same idea there for Germany. So countries that fought well, that were allies, countries that fought poorly, countries that were neutral, and countries that actually murdered our soldiers were now going to get paid off. One of the most generous things any country has ever done. This is also one of the most successful programs of all time. Foreign aid gets very controversial because it's sort of a poster child of how not to spend money, because we have a lot of countries that we give aid to because they're allies and the aid is squandered. The three biggest recipients of foreign aid are Israel, Turkey, and Egypt. Now, Israel mostly spends that on defense. They're actually a pretty wealthy country. They don't need much humanitarian assistance for their own citizens. Turkey and Egypt are quite poor countries, and they could use that money to invest in hospitals and schools and roads. They don't. The corrupt leaders of those countries pocket the money and lavish it on themselves and their, military commanders. It's pumping money down a rat hole, pretty much. It doesn't do much, but it pays off to get the loyalty of those countries. The Marshall Plan was an incredibly successful program that money went to do what it actually did. There were American supervisors there that made sure it wasn't spent that way. And here's kind of how it worked. Let's take Italy, for instance. Italy was completely bombed out and destroyed. Italy is a relatively poor European country compared to Germany or France or Great Britain. But they do have some industries. They make wonderful cars like Ferrari or Lamborghini, or just the everyday company Fiat, which makes kind of like low-end cars. They make Pirelli tires. All of that was destroyed in the war because they were making airplanes and tanks and stuff. Factories were bombed out. So the US spent that money to rebuild the factories to their original specifications to make cars and tires, and then rebuild the roads. And that got people going back to work. And once people have a job and go back to work, they look at that hammer and sickle sign and they go, I'm going to throw that down. I got a job. I can't be busy agitating in the streets because I got a 9-to-5 job now. The plan worked brilliantly. It absolutely destroyed the hardcore communist left in those allied countries of ours. We didn't have to really worry about that anymore. The humanitarian crisis was alleviated. It took a few years to get the money really going and to fully rebuild, but by the early 50s, Western Europe largely had been rebuilt, proving the virtues of the American system. I can't tell you how much, even beyond the fact that the US had tremendous economic and military might, we were respected because of our moral authority. I mean, when you talk to Italian or Greek people during this time period, they could not believe, grown men were just weeping tears and just said, what a marvelous, amazing country. They came all this way across the ocean, liberated us from a tyranny, and they don't want anything. They, in fact, want to give me stuff. There was an entire program in Greece where we bought every farmer a mule, because the Nazis were incredibly cruel and stuff that they did. As they retreated, they would often just execute every farm animal on a farm as they retreated and just said, hey, we're not going to occupy you anymore. It's a scorched earth. We're just going to destroy this civilization. The US came in and said, here you go. We have, humanitarian aid. In countries like Italy and Greece, so many of those family members had immigrated to America that if you ask like a lot of young Italian kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be an American. I have like 12 cousins that live in New York City, and they're just wonderful people, and they're just better off that they're in America. They're just such a fine people. We just love America so much. Our standing is different in the world, better in certain areas, worse in others. In Europe, our standing is okay right now. It's not great. What you find is typically when a Democrat's in the White House, Europeans love us. When a Republican is, they don't like us. They didn't like George W. Bush very much. They didn't like Donald Trump very much. They adored Barack Obama. One of the more interesting statistics is Obama's approval rating in America was basically between 45 and 60% when he was president. It was 80% in Europe. They adored him there. They loved him more than Americans did, pretty much. Same thing in Canada as well. In any case, approval rating of America was sky high in Europe during this particular time because of the Marshall Plan. And so everyone was lining up to be our allies. It was pretty great. Then there were other measures that were felt to be needed by Harry Truman and the Republicans. Starting in 46 and 47, the FBI uncovered quite a bit of spy rings. Stalin had planted spies that infiltrated every corner of the American life. Now, it was probably an overreaction on our part that what could really a lot of these people do? They weren't any threat, existential threat to the existence of America. Yet it was very troubling that the FBI uncovered spies in the Manhattan Project. People like Klaus Fuchs, who was a German emigre. He, fled Nazi Germany in the 30s, went and worked in the Manhattan Project as a physicist. A lot of those scientists were told that this weapon would be controlled by the UN or that it would be shared with the Russians after the war. And after the war was over, Uncle Sam said, nope, we're going to take that intellectual property that you invented and keep it as a secret for ourselves so we can build this terror weapon. And a lot of the scientists felt betrayed. So what did they do? They made secret negotiations with the Russians and leaked them the secrets they needed to make their own bomb. Others like the Rosenbergs, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, did the same thing. Harry Dexter White, Secretary of the Treasury, which is about as high as one can climb in the executive department, he was leaking secrets to the Russians. It's hard to reconcile this. Today we just said, these traitors, I can't believe it. You have to put yourself in the time of 1945 and 46. The US government intentionally had downplayed all the horrible things Joseph Stalin had done. Americans were ignorant a lot of that stuff. All we knew was that the Soviets were allies of ours and that 26 million of their civilians were killed in World War II. And a lot of intellectuals had kind of an admiration for communism and for the Soviet Union. And so they wanted to help them out by doing this. It was foolish. I don't think anybody should have been executed for it, and we would sentence Ethel and Julius Rosenberg to death in the electric chair for doing this. But it was certainly the wrong thing to do. And people were paranoid that every week another communist was caught. J. Edgar Hoover was wiretapping phones and finding out all these people, and they were being rooted out of government. So Harry Truman said, that's enough. If you work for any government aid, I don't care if you're a janitor at a primary school in Idaho, you are working for a state government, or if you're working for a federal government, you are swearing allegiance to the United States. I had to take this oath when I became a teacher in 2003. I thought it was kind of funny, actually, because it was 2003, and they asked me to swear allegiance to the US, and I had to pledge that I was not, nor had I ever been, a member of the Communist Party. And I literally burst out into laughter, and the lady who was swearing me in said, I don't see what's so funny. And I said, the Cold War ended in 1989. Maybe you didn't get the memo. The enemy now is the terrorists. Why aren't you asking me if I've never been a member of Al Qaeda or ISIS or something like that, right? It's 2003. You're asking me if I'm a communist. I never even met a communist before. Communism was collapsing at that point and had collapsed. And so this law, the National Security Act, was passed that would purge all people from the government who had ever joined the Communist Party. Now, understand, there were a lot of people, not millions, but there were tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of young people who kind of flirted with communism in the 30s. Remember, it was the 30s. Capitalism seemed to be collapsing. It was the Great Depression. And some people went to meetings, and that's as far as it went. And by 1940, it was like, oh, well, that was a fad. I'm over it now. And a lot of those people, that came back to haunt them, and they couldn't get a job in government ever again after that. This would also vastly expand the size of the federal government. The Pentagon would be constructed. The name would be changed from the War Department to the Defense Department, which is kind of a nominal change. And certain intelligence agencies would be built. It's rather astonishing that the US had no intelligence services until 1947. Who were we going to spy on? Mexico? Canada? It just seemed like everyone loved us. We had no natural enemies. What do we need an intelligence service for? It's expensive. You don't need spies. Well, during World War II, a temporary one was made called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and they gave us intelligence because we were fighting a war. And it was thought maybe we'd dismantle it after the war was over, but when this threat of communism came about, it was transferred into the CIA, and Truman said, we need a permanent intelligence service. Not only that, we're going to make another one called the NSA, which is going to be kind of another intelligence service. And so this was going to be a huge crusade. This quadrupled the size of the federal government. The US was being incredibly active. You could see that this is the year that the British Empire fell. So there's no coincidence here. Britain is kind of passing the baton to us, saying, you know what, you guys are a free, democratic, rule of law, English-speaking people just like us. We're comfortable with you running the world. Here's the baton, you do it. The US started the war as the 17th best army and ended with the second biggest. And we started the war with the fourth biggest navy and ended with the first biggest navy. Britain couldn't compete anymore. And so the US really usurped that role. And now we're involved in diplomacy in the United Nations, in the World Bank, in the Marshall Plan, in all of these endeavors throughout the world to promote peace. The idea before used to be isolationism. Let that other hemisphere do its own thing. The lesson of World War II is no, we have to be involved because we're a positive force in the world. And we can prevent wars by shaping the world because we're a force for good. And that was the idea. Then the US went a little bit crazy with some of this rooting out of communism. Now, I get that you don't want communists in the State Department and the Army and the intelligence services, et cetera. And those people were all purged. And then there were really ugly things done, like if you had any skeletons in your closet. You know, a lot of people don't know this, but you can't become a cop or an FBI agent if you have huge amounts of debt, if you've got a drug problem, because not only are you seen as sort of a liability, but you can be blackmailed, right? If you're an FBI agent or, you know, you're running or you're working for the federal government and some Soviet agent takes pictures of you using drugs and they say, we're going to show this to your family members unless you work for us and give us all your secrets. That was also applied to homosexuals during this time period. Being gay was not considered okay during this time, but many people worked in the Manhattan Project and the federal government, intellectuals, were gay. And the fear was that Soviet agents would find them, photograph them meeting with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and then blackmail them into working for them. And so if you were gay, you couldn't work for the federal government intelligence services. Some of this still has not been removed. I think until very recently, this was still kind of a standard thing, even though a lot of people are out. They're like, I can't be blackmailed. And everyone in the world knows that I'm gay, right? But still, these kind of, you know, silly little relics from the past remain. US government also applied crazy logic like this to Hollywood and to academia. Now, here's the logic of it, or illogic of it, that we knew that the Soviets were trying to get our nuclear secrets and other security, you know, matters. But the feeling was when communists were discovered in Hollywood and academia that communism might take us over from within, right? The feeling was communism was such a backward system and program that it could never invade or conquer the US from outside, but it might erode us from within. Because there were script writers who in the 30s and 40s joined the Communist Party. One of the most famous of all time was a screenwriter named Dalton Trumbo. He wrote some of the best scripts Hollywood had ever had, but he wasn't a communist. He made no apologies or bones about it. And he was abolished basically from Hollywood. You talk about cancel culture today, right? Like a lot of conservatives say, oh, you know, anytime anyone says something offensive to the left, they'll try to cancel them through Twitter and stuff. They try to get them fired. In the 40s, people were canceled for being a member of the Communist Party. Now, understand, there's a big difference between being a communist and being a Soviet spy. Even Ronald Reagan said this. It was a conservative. Ronald Reagan was a Hollywood actor at the time. He was the union leader for the actors, for SAG at the time, for the Screen Actors Guild. And he even said to Congress, he said, look, I have no problem if someone wants to read the Communist Manifesto and write little articles and have meetings and say communism's a good idea. That's no threat to anybody. We should have freedom of speech in America. You should be able to do that. What we don't want is people working with the foreign hostile government, giving them secrets and aiding them. That is treason. And we didn't heed Ronald Reagan's advice. We veered into the area where we were just persecuting people simply because they happened to be communists. They had no ties with the Soviet government, but they just had ideas that many people didn't like. So HUAC was formed, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and their job, which was ridiculous, was to root out communists throughout the country. And they had these ridiculous hearings in 1947 where they hauled up Hollywood screenwriters and actors and asked them, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And then they would interrogate them and humiliate them. Basically, they knew, they had the evidence there. They knew these people had joined some communist organization in the 30s, but they wanted to humiliate these people in front of the world, right? Film it and then show it in movie theaters and then later on television, and then get them to out all their friends. Who else were at these meetings so that they could be hauled up and humiliate them? Now, we had a Red Scare after the First World War. People were deported, people were locked up. Civil liberties had come quite a ways at that particular time. By this time, FDR had packed the court full of liberals and Truman had continued that process. And the feeling now was that you could be a communist and the government could not lock you up or punish you. But they could use their power to interrogate you. They're not punishing you, but they're getting the information out there so that no one would hire you, right? What studio is going to hire you? You're radioactive, basically. You're toxic. You know, any of these actors today, right? Gina, what's her name from The Mandalorian? No one wants to hire her because she's saying kind of crazy stuff. Likewise, nobody wanted to work with Colin Kaepernick because, you know, at the time when he was kneeling during the anthem, people saw that as a liability, right? Everyone's going to be protesting my football team. Likewise, in the 40s, people would not hire anyone who had been to these HUAC hearings because they said, you're a communist, everyone will boycott my movies. And so they just wouldn't hire you. So hundreds of these people, they had to go move in with their parents. Some of them committed suicide because their lives were ruined. It was a very dark time in America because our paranoia got the better of us. Arthur Miller writes this brilliant play, The Crucible, that's about the Salem witch trials. And we look into our past and we say, we can't let our fears get the better of us where we just are so paranoid that we become our own worst enemy. The Soviets are a problem, but, you know, ridiculous, these questions they were asking, you know. Literally the screenwriters of The Wizard of Oz got up there and they said, this scene where the house falls on one of the witches and all the munchkins come out and celebrate, is that about a communist revolution? And the screenwriter's like, dude, are you insane? Like, what are you on? It's just a movie. It's a silly little movie, musical fantasy for kids. Don't look too much into it. It was silly that people thought that, but they did. Likewise with academia. Hundreds, if not thousands of college professors' lives were ruined because they happened to be communist. And the feeling was they were brainwashing the youth. So they were all purged from the government. Didn't go to prison, but you lost your cushy government job. Okay. I'm going to just talk about one or two things here and then we'll end and then we'll pick this up next time. Going into 1948, Truman had some successes there. He was taking the threat of Soviet communism seriously. The Marshall Plan was rebuilding. Europe, our allies looked strong. He looked, you know, strong, but not crazy. He wasn't going to go to war with the Soviets. And things started to heat up in 1948. In February, you had a coup in Czechoslovakia. Now, Czechoslovakia is one of these countries that was actually left relatively undisturbed by World War II. Hitler took it over without even firing a shot. That country was basically carved up by these pre-war agreements, and it was occupied by the Germans, but no bombs fell on Prague. It was left undisturbed. The Red Army kind of swept in from the east and occupied it. For whatever reason, Stalin imagined that he could just sort of allow the Czech people to like have elections and that they would elect a communist government, and they didn't. When elections were held in early 48, first post-war elections in Czechoslovakia, they elected the non-communists, sort of the liberal Democrats. But the Red Army was still on the ground there. And so Stalin said, all right, the election didn't go how I wanted. So he ordered that the army go and basically arrest every member of the parliament and the prime minister. And many of them were shot and killed in this process. This was brutal. This was ugly. It revealed to people, that Stalin was still a dictator, even though he was an ally during World War II. It was all too temporary and convenient alliance, and that this was awful. It was exactly 10 years after the Munich Agreement, when Czechoslovakia was sold out, to Hitler. And it looked like, what were we going to do? We had to stand up to this guy. We couldn't invade and go to war, but we rang the alarm bell, and a lot of complaints were made during this time that you just can't allow this to happen. Now, I want you to note this. Almost the flip side of this happens 2 months later. The US did not like just the brutal, ugly, clumsy nature of just using our army to assassinate leaders. Similarly, we had our army stationed in Italy. We were helping that country rebuild. Marshall Plan aid was flowing. And they were having elections in 1948, and we were really worried that the communists would win. They were the second largest party, and they were polling really well. We did not have the heart to send American GIs out and just kill every communist civilian in the country. That's not our style. Our style is, let's rig the election and do it in secret. And so the CIA, brand new, not even a year old at this time, perpetrated its first covert op. And this is really cool. I love this story. This is fantastic. You guys might think I'm making this up. This is 100% true. Go Google it, look it up. This is wild what we were able to do in April of 48 in Italy. Again, if the communists in Italy take over, you don't need Stalin's tanks to run into Rome. You don't need the rebels there to take over by force. Just elections allow you to do that in a democracy. And Stalin was aiding the Communist Party of Italy, giving them money. And so we figured we had to give money to the opposition. Now, Italian law prevents that. You can't just write a check and say, CIA, here you go, $10 million to the Social Democrats. The Christian Democrats were actually the largest party there. It was sort of a Catholic democracy party. And laws prevent that, just like we have laws where foreign governments can't give our parties money. You don't want foreign influence on your elections. And so the CIA decided to launder money and funnel it to that party illegally, basically. But they didn't know how to do it. And this is where the story gets just delicious. The CIA actually went to the mafia in New Jersey and New York and asked them for help laundering money. This is not a joke. This must have been pretty funny. These guys in, suits and ties show up and knock on the door and say, hey, I'd like to talk to Vinny, right? Is Vinny there? And Vinny says, I don't know what you're talking about, right? We're not here. We know that you guys sell heroin and run houses of prostitution and gambling, and we'd like to talk to you. I don't know what you're talking about. And they say, look, we're not the FBI. We honestly don't care. You go ahead and run your little illegal schemes. We want to know how you launder money, right? How do you collect millions of dollars every year and fool the IRS? And the mafia members essentially said, what are you doing? Well, we're trying to stop the communists from taking over Italy. And the mafia, if the mafia is anything, they're capitalists. They hate the communists. And they say, hey, why can't a business owner get a free break? We hate the communists. Sure, we'll help you keep them out of Italy. That's the mother country, right? So they explain it. Here's what you do, right? If you've ever seen the show Breaking Bad, this is the problem Walter White had, right? If you guys haven't seen Breaking Bad, it's basically about a chemistry teacher who gets lung cancer and he can't afford a proper treatment. So he decides to start making his own meth and selling it. And it becomes very violent and crazy. It's a good show. But Walter White has this problem. He's making meth, he's selling it. He has all the money in the world, but how do you explain that when you buy a mansion and when you have all this money in your bank account? The IRS is going to want to know where it came from when you file your taxes every year. And so what you do is you build what's called a front. You build a fake business, right? And in Breaking Bad, that was the car wash, right? You have a business that doesn't really make money, actually, but on paper, it does. You don't have to actually show your receipts to the IRS. You just claim, I made $100 million last year from my car wash, right? Or, probably in the 40s, a lot of these businesses were like, Mamma Mia's olive oil company or, Papa Gino's Italian pizzeria or whatever. And it doesn't actually make any money, the business, but all the illegal money that you make through selling drugs and houses of prostitution, you claim it's from there, and bada boom, bada bing, you get to keep your money, right? I'm sorry, that was, you know, playing into Italian stereotypes. I would never do that, right? So the CIA gets all these lessons and they do the same thing. They make fake companies and they take federal money and funnel it into these companies, and these companies in Italy can then donate the money, right? And that's essentially what they do. And then it's all covert, it's all secret. Similarly, the CIA goes into public schools all throughout New Jersey and New York with heavily Italian populations and talks to the teachers and says, you know, we want a letter writing campaign. Wouldn't it be nice if we got all these Italian kids, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth graders, to write letters to their cousins in Italy and tell them, hey, these communists are really bad. You saw what they did in Czechoslovakia. They killed all these people. They took over the government there. Don't vote for them. They're evil. We even got the Pope in on it. The Pope met with the CIA and we said, you know, it'd be great. You have a lot of cachet in Italy. You're a Catholic country. And the Pope actually went on radio and said, any young girl, if you're dating a young man that's a communist, you cannot get married in the church. Your children cannot be baptized. And that was devastating to millions of young people who wanted to get married in the Catholic Church. A lot of Italian people, like a lot of Europeans, they don't really go to church weekly, but it's important for the sacraments. It's important for your kid to get baptized. It's important to get married in the church. It's important to get your last rites and your burial rites. And you get very upset if you don't get those things. And so the Pope announced all this. This program was incredibly successful. It's one of these weird things where the CIA, when they have a great success, no one knows about it and you get no credit because it's covert, and you get all the blame when it is public, right? Like the Bay of Pigs invasion blew up in everyone's face. It was a huge disaster and they got all the blame, right? But you can't go and broadcast it when you have success. Notice the two ways of doing it, right? The Russians basically are sort of grunting Neanderthals, right? They're like, hey, our soldiers are in Czechoslovakia, use brute force and kill the people we don't like. America were like, ooh, that just makes us uncomfortable. Why don't we just rig the election, right? And that's what we did. So I'll go ahead and stop there. We'll continue this next time. We're about at the halfway point. But Harry Truman's coming into his own, and spoiler alert, he is going to win re-election very narrowly, one of the closest races ever. It's an incredible success story. This hick from Missouri that accidentally became president had a very low approval rating in 1946 and built his way back in 47 and 48, mainly through foreign policy, working with a Republican Congress, a Democratic president. It's extraordinary. It's a great story. All right, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you enjoyed that. We will continue on with the Cold War next time. I will see you then. Bye-bye.